Trigger warning. This podcast is about grief. Whether you are newly bereaved or whether you have been stuck in grief for years, I do hope this podcast brings you some comfort. Grief is such a universal experience, but we all do it differently. This podcast is not about fixing you or forcing the healing process because there is no cure for grief. It can only be experienced, absorbed, loved and cared for. So whether you are doing it privately behind closed doors or like me, you are kicking and screaming your way through, let's support each other. My name is Louise Bates, and my hope is that this podcast shines a light on your path and gives you the strength to navigate your way through the grieving process. I'm sending you so much love and support, and I look forward to sharing this journey with you. Welcome to A Gift for Grief, the podcast that explores the many shapes and shades of grief and the unexpected gifts that can come from navigating profound loss. I'm your host, Louise Bates, and today's episode touches on a form of grief that often goes unnamed. One that can feel confusing, isolating, and incredibly painful. The grief of being left without explanation. When someone we love simply disappears, it can leave us trapped in limbo with unanswered questions. My guest today, Catherine Williamson, knows this kind of loss intimately. She's here to share her story of what it was like to have her partner vanish from her life, the complex grief that followed, and how she's been navigating her healing journey without the closure many of us take for granted. This is a story about abandonment, but also about resilience. It's about learning to live with the unknown and eventually finding meaning within it. Catherine is now happily married, so this podcast does have a happy ending. So wherever you are, take a breath and join us for this honest and heartfelt conversation. Welcome, Catherine.
Hello, Louise.
Thank you for being a guest on my podcast today. Now, we've known each other for quite a few years, and I think we first met when I was invited to your dairy to listen to a talk, and you did this wonderful lunch. And then we met at a retreat in the Cotswolds. And then a few years later, you invited me back to the dairy to do a talk about my books. And we've become friends over the years. And I have to say, you have massively impacted my life in a positive, magical way. I'm very grateful to have you in my life. You are one of the reasons this podcast started, because you invited me onto your podcast, Gobsmacked. And it took me a year to get there because it was terrifying. But now here I am with my own podcast from being a guest on yours. And am I allowed to say I might have a bit of a girl crush on you?
You're allowed to say it. Any homaging to me is absolutely permitted. In fact, don't ever hold back on the praise.
Okay. So you did send me a bio, and I have to say, if I read your bio out, we wouldn't have any time left for the episode because you do so many things. So could we start with you telling us about yourself and what you do?
Okay, so at this point in life, I'm 60 years of age and I've had quite a checkered romantic past, but now very happily married. And that feels like, I think relationships are the hardest thing and marriage is the toughest things. And the fact that I'm on a 17-year PB with Johnny Boy is a wonderful thing. I've had a number of careers just because I'm somebody that can't do boring or routine very well. But the one that's been consistent for the last 25 years is I work as an executive coach. And by that, I work in a corporate framework and I do leadership development. But a lot of that I don't really put out into the world because I think in certain parts of our life we need to have a bit of mystique, because over the last 25 years I've been privy to so many thousands of secrets. I tend to play that down. But I have become way more known to people now as a podcaster, which is something that I'm into my third year. And it's surprising I've done so many things, but that's become the headline attached to me. And that's probably because it's the one thing I've been prepared to really stick my head above the parapet, because you have to get listeners, don't you, for all the work we do on these things. Yeah. I like bringing people together, and I'm happy to say please be my friend. I'll cook you a meal. I'll cook you breakfast. Come to my house. And then I patch together groups of women that could be 15 or 20 strong. And I suppose one of the things I would say, if you looked at my life as that theme that runs through it, I've sort of glued together different social groups. And podcasting is a way of gluing now, isn't it? You know,
Definitely, yes.
Yeah, there's people I know with my podcast, and I'm sure the same with yours. I can see people on that first day of release, and I know parts of the world that are consistently listening to me.
Yeah.
And I find that a remarkable thing, that we exist in this way to people without ever having met them.
It is incredible, and your podcast is very successful. You've got to tell us how many countries it's in now.
Well, it's currently in 123 countries, and once upon a time I would get 2 or 3 new countries every new episode, just because. But both you and I, Louise, have put our voice out to a super saturated place. There's apparently 70 million episodes added to every day, 5 million different podcasts out there being added to every day. I feel like a little one of those, you know, those little plants that get just into the little cleft of a cliff and gets stuck in and grows, and the wind blows. And podcasting is a highly saturated place, but people keep finding me, and people keep finding you, and we keep finding each other, don't we?
Well, you're great at networking and bringing people together, and you are like a local celebrity, aren't you? I mean, you know everybody and everybody knows you. But unless you're a massive celebrity, it is hard to get your podcast out there. But to get yours out into so many countries and to get so many listens, it is incredible.
Well, what I understand now is, and this is a stat I've been given, that only 20% of people consistently stick at it. So you've got a load of episodes out, and I've got a load of episodes out. So once this bubble bursts, as it inevitably will, there'll be us there with our collection of information out in the world. And I think if you keep your ego in the right place and your intention in the right place, then people will find us. If we're meant to be found, they'll find us.
Yes. And they're out there forever now, aren't they? So as you know, this podcast is about grief. And it's important to recognise that grief isn't just about the death of a loved one. We can experience grief in various forms, such as the loss of a job or the impact of redundancy. We can grieve for the life we've had before a medical diagnosis, or even the distress with financial setbacks. In fact, there are over 40 different types of losses that can create feelings of grief, including the heartache that accompanies a relationship breakup. Now, it was a few months ago during one of our conversations where you shared with me the challenges you faced following a relationship breakdown many years ago. Could you tell us about this, but only share as much as you feel comfortable with?
Yeah, so I see this as one of those moments in my life that completely put me on a path that would lead to about 2 decades of disruption, and I really see it as one of those pivotal moments. But if I put it in context, so when I was 18, my mum died suddenly. She had a brain aneurysm, and I was the eldest of 4 kids, and I went into that phase of grief where I was just totally numb. Within a month of burying my mum, I was at university, and I was very, very lost and alone. I was at a London university. I come from a comprehensive school. I was in South Kensington. A couple of times I saw Lady Diana at the time going past in a Golf GTI. It was the time of the yuppie, and I did not fit that mould. I was also placed on the religious corridor, as they called it at the time, because I'd put on my hall admission that I collected fungi and herbs. So I'm with a group of very lovely, innocent women, by and large, that were trying to make me cups of tea, where all I wanted was to meet a fella and go to the Union Bar. Anyway, I look back at that chapter of my life knowing it was exactly the right place for me. But that was to lose my mum that knocked me off my axis. Came out of university, went off travelling for a year, came back and went on a blind date. My sister was on a blind date, that was it, with a guy. And she asked me to come along because what if they didn't get on? Well, they immediately weren't right for each other, but me and him got on with it really famously. And within a not so long period of time, I was living with him. And for a lot of reasons, it was the start of my career. I'd found myself in sales. I was doing very well in sales. He was doing very well as well. He was extremely successful. And I'd written a sort of script for how this was going to play out. And we had a couple of years, fun years, you know, there was a lot going on. His business was developing. And then there's none so blind as don't want to see. And at Christmas, he would go to his family for Christmas and I would go to mine. And then we would get back together again on Boxing Day or the day after. And I was so excited about seeing him, and he was due back at about 10 o'clock in the morning. And he finally showed up at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I just didn't ever think any more about it. But in that intervening period, I checked whether there'd been any major accidents. It wasn't like it was a mobile phone time, but it wasn't a mobile phone time. But then he was there and then it was done. But definitely from Christmas onwards, something had changed. Something had changed. And we get to about March. In fact, it was March. And he was very distant. And I was doing absolutely everything I could to try and rehook him back into my life. And then he told me that he was going to go away on business for a week and that I hated being on my own in the house. And he said, probably best to go and stay at your dad's, is how I recall it. And I say how I recall it because sometimes these things become the story you tell yourself, don't you? So I went back to my dad's house and basically it was a Thursday morning and I knew the credit card bill was due in and I knew it was gone to the house I lived in rather than my dad's house. So I turned up there, let myself in, and there was some cards on the floor, one of which was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. ... and my credit card bill. And I opened this letter because I thought whoever sent this to Mr. and Mrs. plainly thinks we're married. So then I read this card, which is congratulating him on his wedding to this woman the previous Monday. So it'd be Thursday. So he got married 3 or 4 days previously in Conway Registry Office. And what happened to me was I read it. I couldn't comprehend what I was reading. And the shock was so much, I just slumped to the floor.
Yeah.
My legs gave way and I just slumped to the floor. And I was sort of dazed. And then I remember just going from room to room and I sort of the speed at which it was almost like frenetic because every room that I'd lived in with him, that had been our home, it was his home, it wasn't our joint home. Little trinkets were off the shelves, things I'd bought him were no longer there. And suddenly, as I got from room to room, I realised I'd essentially been erased. And then I looked and found 2 cardboard boxes under the bed in the spare room, and that got all my possessions and things, little bits in there. There were still clothes and things, but by and large, he just pulled things off the shelf. And essentially, our life together had been put into these 2 cardboard boxes. So what had happened is, he sort of waved me off to see my dad's house, he'd essentially gone round the house because he knew he was getting married. And he probably felt he'd communicated to me that our relationship was over. Whatever he felt he'd told me, it didn't come to me as that.
Okay.
So I'm now in this position that I've essentially been packed away in 2 cardboard boxes under the spare bed.
So this is your home?
It's our home that we've shared together. You know, time becomes a bit sort of lost, but in total we were probably together for nearly 3 years. But the script I'd written for our lives and the life I'd written for us was one that was certainly not going to be him marrying somebody else and packing me away in cardboard boxes. And whatever the to's and fro's of it and whatever he would say he'd said to me or what I'd heard, I was in total and utter shock at what had happened. And not only was I in total and utter shock, but nobody could believe it either. No. When I was ringing up saying, he's got married, people were just they were as aghast as I was. So now I'm in the situation where I'm back living at my dad's house. There's a piece of this which I think is really important to reference. So on the morning I'd literally slumped to the floor, found out the bloke I loved was married to somebody else. I had a job interview that afternoon. And how I got to that job interview, I had to drive to Leicester. I did an interview. I think you'd probably call it disassociation. I got to that interview, did a great interview, got home, and then literally started the process of being in total shock. As it happened, I got the job. And that's, to my absolute credit, I credit myself, and to the fact that I had the strength and fortitude, and also I didn't like letting people down. That job was the beginning of the next chapter of my life, which was a phenomenally successful chapter. But I still was in this state of total shock.
Yeah.
So what happened then was, literally for days and days and days, I literally was nearly 2 weeks off work.
Yeah.
In the interim, I'd found out I got a new job. So I knew I was never going to go back to that old job, in the same way I was never going to go back to that old world. It was sort of like one of these clear moments of endings and beginnings. But I couldn't stop crying. I ended up having to do a speech at my mum's funeral. I'd ended up with a traumatised father, a traumatised family, and I had not shed any tears at all for the death of my mum. So this event seared into me in a way I almost described. I remember as a kid reading about the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, and that as they chipped into a room that had been sealed off centuries before, there was just this shaft of light comes in onto the tomb, and they know that they found a pharaoh's sarcophagus, but I'm not sure if that's something you swallow. Not esophagus, anyway. Bottom line is, something of so much pain seared into a part of me that I'd walled off years previously. And whilst I was in this traumatised state of loss about this guy, what it did was, it got the tears flowing, because I simply couldn't stop crying. I would be crying and crying and crying, and it was uncontrollable. I lost about probably easily a stone and a half over a couple of weeks, because 2 weeks I couldn't eat. And I remember it's one of the most intimate memories I ever have with my dad. I was staying there. He could see I was in trauma, and he could see he couldn't get me to eat, because I'm one of those people that my stomach shuts off if I can't, I'm upset, really upset, I just can't eat. Yeah. And it was about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, and Dad had come into the bedroom, and he sat down and he got this bowl, and he said, "Right, Catherine, I've been tossing and turning all night, and I've been trying to think of something that I would eat that would make me want to eat, that I would fancy eating." And he said, "So I've made it for you." And my dad was no cook. And I didn't have a clue what was in this bowl, except I could already feel my stomach rising. I'm not the best eater in the morning. I'm certainly not the best eater at 6 o'clock in the morning. And he'd made me cold, it was bananas, cold tinned custard, carnation milk round the edge, and a flake.
Oh,
right, okay. Now you imagine that.
Yeah.
Right, okay. But my dad is looking into my eyes with such... he's frightened now.
Yeah.
He's frightened because I'm in a downwards... I'm down, down, down. He doesn't know when it's going to stop. And he's... I've got no mum. And there's an elemental thing that passes... It doesn't matter that I'm 24 years of age or whatever I was at the time. I'm his daughter. I'm his child, and I'm not eating.
Yeah.
And he's thinking about getting me eating again. And I knew the need for that food to go in me was greater than my need to repel it. And is it the film Cool and Luke, where he eats about 20 boiled eggs and they sort of sit... Every mouthful of banana that went in, I'd swallow it.
Yeah.
And he never took his eyes off me. And he had the most beautiful brown eyes, and he just fed me like a child. And he just fed me. And I got to a certain point, I said, "Dad, I can't eat anymore." But he said, "That's all right. We've got you eating again."
Yes, yeah.
And of so many things, that parental desire to get food into a child that was suffering was such there was an exquisiteness about it.
Yeah.
But it was the fact that my dad there had laid in bed all night thinking, what can he do to get me eating again? And it was the beginning of kicking back,
Okay.
because I did pull back through it. But unrequited love, bearing in mind I'd lost my mum,
Yeah.
unrequited love was more painful and stunned me like a rhino dart, more so than losing my mum.
Grief is, it comes in many shapes and shades, doesn't it? So you had a sense that something wasn't right and you were trying your best to make things right. Then you have this enormous shock of he's just disappeared, and it's your home as well. It's a massive life-changing experience.
I think ripping up your dreams,
Yeah.
I think there's something about potential, the loss of that potential. And I'm somebody that, I'm a big dreamer. So the life I'd written for us. And when I first met him, he was in a lot of financial trouble. There'd been a lot of, his financial director had embezzled a lot of money that he went to prison for. And in the beginning of our relationship, we were up against potentially the bailiffs coming. This guy was a brilliant businessman and he came up with a plan and he ended up buying his biggest competitor. So at the point that he exits my life, we've gone from worrying about the bailiffs to he's a CEO flying to appointments. He's got a yacht. He's got, I remember a Sierra Cosworth. And financially, he was in ignition point. And I was very happy to consider myself as the CEO's wife. I could have carried that gig. But I did not feature in that next stage. And what was more wounding than ever, I did find out who he married and things like that. But he married a woman that was so not suited to that life.
How interesting.
She wasn't in any way suited to that life. So my dad went and had a conversation with him and he said, you're going to have to come and tell her. He came and saw me many, many weeks later. But I was still so stunned. I was still in such a state. I still couldn't fathom what had gone on. But probably maybe 4 or 5 years later, time does feel a bit sort of strange. Feelings carry longer than time, don't they, sometimes?
Yeah.
Dates. But I was at a wedding where we were both at, and the woman he'd married was at this wedding. And I went to sit with her. And I could see him he came along to immediately split us up. And she said, no. No. And we sat and talked. And what I realised was she'd known nothing about me. She knew nothing about the degree to which I'd been involved in his life. She was genuinely really shocked about what had happened. And of course, in all of this time, I demonised the woman.
Yes. Yeah.
It's so much easier to turn the woman into the big I wasn't best pleased with him. But I could see in her face genuine...
So she got a different perspective of the person she was with.
As he packaged me off to make the new life, the truth is the truth. He will have his take on it. I had my take on it.
Yes, yeah.
But there's a rounding off of this experience. So the day he took over that business that made him a very successful businessman, I was in his life. And we may be talking 25, 30, it could be up to maybe 25, 30 years later. Is it as long as that? It could have been. I, in my new life, was running a programme. I was now married to John. And I was staying in a hotel and I was running a programme. And I went down to breakfast and he was sat at a table in breakfast.
Okay.
On the periphery of, it was somewhere near Warrington. And he was there having breakfast. And so I sat and joined him. And we chatted. And he said, you'll never guess. He said, this is my final day in the business. He said, I've been ousted off the board. And he didn't say it, but we both knew that I had breakfast with him on the first day.
Yes.
And I was there on his final day. And in between that, he'd got married and divorced. And he got remarried, I think. So that marriage with her didn't prosper. He got remarried. and I had been the constant between the beginning of that career
Yes.
and that end of that career. So we sat together in the ending of his career, which I thought was an actually incredible coincidence.
How did you feel in that moment?
In that moment, there's a lot of unsaid words. In the whole time and subsequent meetings, I think never really fully expressed the distress or whatever. I don't know, because what my dad said very much around the time of the cold banana and custard meeting was, Kath, and I remember him saying, Kath, what's happened is horrible. It's really frightening. He said, but this man's married. He's gone.
Yeah.
He's not coming back. You're going to have to start again. And it's a definite position, because in that relationship there was some bouncing around. I knew in my heart he wasn't as into me as I was into him.
Okay.
And I can see now that the girl I was in that relationship was traumatised. This need for relationship. I wasn't a balanced future partner. I know that now. And probably it took a lot to make me equal to having a relationship. All of that said, I'd built my house, my dreams on this relationship. And the fault line it put through me and my life was, in my terms, something comparative to the Sant Andreas fault. Because I met a new man 6 months later and we were together. I got married to a man. I left him after a matter of weeks. I'd fallen out of love. I then get involved with there was a lot of overlapping. That's an entirely different story. There's certainly no whiter than white in that one. I remarry. I have children. I then, 5 or 6 years later, hightail out of that marriage. I end up with a bloke that was a walking red flag and then was to go again. And part of the reason why I see that as 2 marriages and 2 decades of chaos was my trust was utterly obliterated.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions, was how does that experience impact your trust in other people and future relationships?
Well, there's a whole sorry tale about choosing people that when my third and final husband, John, proposed to me on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which I thought was a proposal, but turned out to be a holding statement, another story. But he dropped to his knees, rattling around for this ring on the ring attachment, the RAD device. As he went, he's sort of down on his knees, holding up the ring, and he said, I want to make you a lifelong commitment, Catherine, that may or may not be evidenced by the act of marriage on the basis that you have problems with the commitment. And I remember looking at him thinking, is it a proposal? I was like a mongoose in front of a snake. He's holding up this ring and I'm going, and then, mate, a lifelong commitment. Anyway, I thought I'd said yes to marriage. Anyway, he sort of said this. It was the first time anybody confronted me with the idea that I had issues with commitment.
Okay.
Now, I think it's pretty obvious in my behaviour that I had issues with commitment. But in a sense, I was choosing people or situations where, for whatever reason, I'd always got the exits. I had always got the exits.
Yeah.
And at least twice I'd been through them. And here I was being confronted with the fact that this man was saying, I know that potentially I did watch The Runaway Bride after that, and Julia Roberts pegging it out the church, because there was this real enormity that actually it was me that was having the problem committing.
Yeah.
And yet I was always projecting it onto these blokes, or that they weren't this, or they didn't do that, or they didn't deliver that. Meanwhile, hiding in plain sight was me terrified of committing. And I could pin that potentially at the death of my mum.
Yes.
Yeah. 18 years of age, been and gone in 4 days, that brought up all sorts.
Massively, yes. Yeah.
There's a whole number of reasons why abandonment, every number of reasons. But when you are heartbroken and somebody is with somebody else, and for whatever reason, other people, well, actually, in fairness, so many people are amazed. I can play it back. I can see he tried. I can see we were bouncing. I moved out for a week. I went back to my dad's for a week. You know, I can see he, as my sister would say, he just wasn't that into me.
Right.
But I was into him, or I was
Yeah.
into what I believed was going to be my future.
Yeah.
And when a relationship's not going to prosper, one person has the gig of doing the chucking and one person gets chucked.
Yeah. Yeah.
And being the person that gets chucked because you've lost control of the situation and you have to make a decision about how you see your circumstances.
But what helped you most in processing this unique kind of loss?
I would absolutely say I didn't do a lot of processing. I did a lot of doing. So I went into frenetic. I'd started being frenetic after my mum died. I'd seen her drop dead before her 41st birthday, and I made a decision when she died that I wouldn't be her and I wouldn't have her life. Now, interestingly, there was patterns of her life I did repeat. But I went to warp and I was living life at pace. I was to continue going that fast and that furiously, because if you stop still to let your feelings engulf you for any period of time. So it took me to crash my career, end up in rented with 2 young kids, with a very unhappy ex-husband, a father that was demoralised and so upset about choices he saw me making, financially terrified about the decisions I'd made, with kids looking at them, to me to be the grown-up. And at that point, I thought, if I don't do some form of therapy, if I don't start, I'm going to start repeating the patterns. I'm already repeating the patterns. It didn't come to me at that dawning light, but I'd started training as a psychotherapist. And of course, I'd gone down the path of going to the place where the therapy was on hand as part of, we had to do 40 hours a year as part of our training.
Yeah.
And I was traumatised training to be a therapist when all I really needed was the therapy.
Yeah.
And I did lots of different avant-garde type things to try and start to heal. But I had to have a massive moment in my life where if you destabilise one part of your life, you've always got another part of your life to fall back on. But by the time I'd left my marital home, I'd lost my job, I'd lost my income, I'd lost my identity in my corporate life. I'm in rented. I've pitched my hopes on a guy that doesn't deliver. And the plan I've so followed has not come to pass. I've caused tremendous hurt and disorientation. I've pushed friends to the absolute limit. My family are just thinking, when's she going to stabilise? Because I'd been the strong one.
Yeah.
And families don't enjoy the strong one going remarkably out of control. And I had to make a choice about what I did now. And the thing that got me through was the school run.
The school run?
Yeah, because I had to get up in the morning to get those kids to school. If I had a bad day, I couldn't lie in bed and drink half a bottle of whiskey because I had Miss Bran waiting for Joseph and the school run. And I would go to the school run with my lipstick on, a shadowy figure. And then somebody would have a cup of coffee. Then I'd have to get to the butchers or the greengrocers, Richard Clark, the greengrocer. And I would get some food in. One of the things I did every night was home-cooked food for my kids.
Yeah.
So getting the food in, plus I had to earn money. And then I would go to school run at 3:20. So I had that bit of day to fill. And if there was a coffee and I got some food and I cooked some food, then I would sit round and watch my kids eat that meal again, just as my dad had watched me eat that banana.
Wow.
And if I got food in my kids, and then we had a bath and we did the spellings, and they forced structure on what would have been chaos.
Yeah.
Because my determination to be a better parent than I was, and the fact that those structures around me gave me routine, that meant I just didn't spin off completely.
Yeah.
School run and then friendships, and bit by bit normalising. And then I've got to say it, finally meeting somebody in the form of John.
Yes.
That put the bins out, loved me and was never going to leave me. John, as a Christian, clearly stated he would only leave this marriage as a result of getting in his coffin. I was terrified by that idea initially. And then I realised how reassuring that somebody's not going to leave you.
Yeah.
They are literally going to stay with you till death us do part.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not, and I'd love to say it's because he loves me, but when you've got somebody with a God framework to their life, he's got a higher order of things that keeps him faithful. Because he's not only got to deal with me, he's got to make peace with his master. And suddenly the realisation that somebody was going to stay with me for life.
Yeah.
And he meant it. And then got the bus fare out and got the bins out and provided stability around my kids.
Oh, well, you guys are hilarious, and I love your Facebook posts. They really brighten my day. And as mom, you've done a fantastic job, because I have to say you have two amazing adult children now that you must be very, very proud of.
I'm so relieved. I read a book once. I don't know whether you remember it, called Families and How to Survive Them. It was a book with Robin Skinner, who's a therapist, doing interviews with John Cleese, who had a terrible, prone to terrible bouts of depression.
Yeah.
And there's a quote I clung to which says, "It's in our inadequacies as parents that we give our children the space to grow." And thank the Lord that my kids had a very fragile version of me. And I've got two very empathic kids, but my kids are so much more grounded than I ever was.
Okay.
And I think something about my vulnerability, something about, we spoke about our feelings every night because my feelings poured out of me, but also that we were a very tight team. We were a very tight team. And also that I invited a man in. I never lived with another man till I married John, which was good. I had emotional hijinks, but I never lived. And the guy I brought in, they saw was pro me and pro family and pro them. Yeah. And I chose wisely.
You certainly did.
I chose wisely because I rejected John on sight, to be fair. But when I realised he was kind, that started to break this. It felt to me a bit like when I've read the story about the Snow Queen, when there's the shard of glass and it washes out of the eye. That was the beginning, kindness and tenderness. John is many, many things, but he's incredibly kind and thoughtful.
Yeah, yeah.
And he, with his rather routine, devotion to routine and structure, started to normalise me.
Yeah.
Because when you live on your own for a period of time, and you're internet dating at 1 a.m, and you've got no other adult going, you go to bed now, put your laptop down. I was overworking, over-romanticising, everything was excessive. And then you've got somebody in the house that says it's not normal to be up at 3 o'clock doing emails. Is it not? If you haven't got another regulating adult in the house, your life can get quite surreal.
So it's brought a lot of gifts into your life.
Oh my! I have been subject to a miracle.
So have you found any meaning or lessons over time from the grief that you've experienced?
There's so many that I wouldn't even know where to begin. But the one thing that I really believe to be true is, you mentioned my two beautiful kids. And if you take the spiritual perspective, is that they chose me to be their parent. And they chose my ex-husband to be their dad. And on that basis, this guy that dumped me quite spectacularly had to get out of the way.
Yes.
And there were men that came and men that went. There was men that thought I was sticking around longer than I did. But believe you me, I have left a trail of heartbreak. For all the stuff that I took in my early 20s, I more than deathed it back. There's a book I read, and I remember the back cover, and it says, "Damaged people are dangerous, they know they can survive." And I'm a survivor, and I was a damaged survivor.
Yeah.
And if it was your heart that was at stake at that point in time, when I was in that spin cycle, I wasn't the best romantic possibility on the planet. So as I was hurt, I have also caused damage and hurt. But it took me a long time to balance. And I think one of the things I would say that the biggest learning is that those two children were always travelling towards me. people come and people go, but everything has its divine place.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And I think that in our vulnerability and in our fragility, there is a way that we can connect with other people that is almost an alien landscape till you've been through it. That's your podcast, isn't it? You're doing this to connect.
Yeah.
People do not want to join the club you are the founder member of your podcast because you've lost a child. A lot of people are more familiar with heartbreak and unrequited love. It's much more of the everyday, but it can be in and of itself devastating.
What would you wish people understood more about grief caused by abandonment and disappearance?
Well, there's this recent programme that it's the Bridget Jones film where she's with the young guy, and he ghosts her. I only just recently watched it with John. It was great. I've loved all Bridget Jones, but this one really struck home. And she won't go. The devastation he causes her by not responding to her texts. And I think one of the things that I've really want to impress upon people, it's so much harder having to try and tie the loose ends up for yourself. So this ability to just disconnect socially, to be full on somebody's Facebook page, on texting, and then to stop dead and stop communicating, that pains me more. The anticipation of what I might have done wrong or where that. Yeah. And I think it's this thing about we owe it to each other to be a little bit more honest and to keep communicating.
Yes.
And for me, a modern day full plugged in, full intense dopamine relationship where you've got the texting and all the socials to then be pulled out is so disorientating. It's like being pulled out the Matrix. It's like having that pipe yanked off the back of your neck.
Yeah.
I didn't have that to deal with. I didn't have to see him on his wedding photos on social. I didn't have to do any of that in my day. But I think it's that bit about putting yourself back together is so much harder when you've just got to try and work out the endings for yourself or fill the gaps in. Because then you can demonise the women, or you can what ifs or maybes and what have you.
Yeah.
And I've got a very fermenty brain. I could make up all sorts of scenarios.
Yeah.
And he would probably have said, if he was sat in this room now, he said, I did tell you, Catherine. I did try and tell you.
Yeah.
I did try and tell you. But I wasn't ready for hearing it.
So ambiguous loss, which is the type of loss that occurs when there's no clear closure or resolution. What would you say to the person listening who may be going through a similar kind of loss?
A piece of advice I was given that I never listened to was, I think it comes from marriage guidance counselling, that you're meant to have a month single for every year that you've been with somebody. I had a new bloke ready, waiting for the next bloke to go. And I would try and get them to chuck me if I'd already moved on, so I didn't have to feel guilty. And I'd have a next one installed, right? Okay. The biggest singular thing that I would advise people to do in respect of a relationship is give yourself time to heal.
Yeah.
Work the feelings through. Sit present to the loss, because you'll only do and reinstate all of that stuff in a new relationship. And it's a burden on a new relationship, unrequited, when you haven't done the grief bit. So the more time you put in to respect the relationship that's gone by and give yourself some time to heal, the better chance you've got of getting into a new relationship with some measure of stability. And people recruit certain types of people to play the game with. So if you're on the spin cycle, as I call it, you're disorientated from another relationship, you're not in any state to love anybody again.
Now, I know you've lost both your parents. So did the grief that you experienced through the ambiguous loss feel very different to losing mum, dad, or other people in your life?
I think the degree to which you get prepared. We had no preparation for my mum. She collapsed in the kitchen. 4 days she was gone. that's shock.
That is,
Yeah.
yeah, that's shock.
Getting a card and finding a card that somebody you love has got married is a shock, but they're still alive.
Yeah.
But they're not accessible anymore, or your dreams are not accessible anymore. With my dad, we had a number of months to prep.
Yeah.
So that gave us more time to make peace with the idea of it. So I do think there's the degree to which you have time to get into readiness
Yeah.
for what's coming down the line makes a big difference.
That's
to how
the anticipatory grief that you're
starting to work things through.
Yeah.
So I think that the more you can bring people onto the page, because I think people are a lot more resilient and a lot more capable of dealing with stuff if you're just very, very clear with them. But there's one overarching message I would want to give people from all of this, which might seem a bit off beam. At the time of the said relationship collapsing to the floor, getting married, I was approached by a journalist on the Daily Mail. She offered me £2,000 for my story. And if I was going to be vengeful, that was the time. I mean, I was totally disorientated. But my dad said to me, one, I didn't want to do it, I was too frightened. But my dad said to me, Catherine, if you're in the business of revenge, dig 2 graves.
Wise words.
And I didn't do the article. I made sure he knew I could have. Word got back to him that I'd been offered money. I relieved I never did that.
Yeah.
I'm so relieved I never did that. That I took the wisdom. It was bad enough, but if I'd have brought revenge in, and I would have genuinely, in those days, we did wrap fish and chips in newspaper.
Yes.
I would have been yesterday's news. It would have been a sensational story. I possibly would have made it onto the couch of Good Morning, but it wouldn't have changed the fact that he was gone.
Yeah.
And I would have had a whole load of other disorientating things to deal with. So I'm so pleased that there was a groundedness and a wisdom, wherever it came from, not to take that money.
Yeah. Your dad was a wise man.
Oh, my God. My dad was. And, of course, what I realise is a lot of that wisdom is I've got those interjected parent voices that even if I had that to draw upon, because somehow that didn't feel the right thing to do.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts about the afterlife and the spirit world?
My childhood was with a grandmother that was psychic in every sense of the word, and she would summon up ghosts. So I was exposed to ghosts and spirits being in the house and saying the prayer of deliverance, leave us go. You could feel it, and we all got used to it as little kids. Oh, go now, leave us in peace, that sort of thing. So I think it's a bit like skiing. If you get in there before you realise you're going to die, it's a good thing to know that learn to ski, learn to horse ride, ski, and do all those things before you become aware of your mortality. So I had that upbringing. I never needed to be convinced of it, but would also say that used spiritual practices, not in just, John said to me when I was going on about my spiritual side, he said, well, as far as I can tell with your spiritual practice, you just used to go to a tarot card reader to find out when the next fellow was coming. And I was going, he's right. I think it's the degree to which you're going to do the work.
Yeah.
If you're in that spiritual practice, so afterlife, I absolutely believe that, I believe we come back. I feel very strongly connected to my family that are on the other side. I feel that there is a whole big divine plan. I still feel we have left and right choices within it. But I do feel that if you're walking that spiritual path, it's the willingness to take the journey inside and sit with the awful feelings and sit with it and do the right thing and do whatever practice it takes you to sort of sit and ground yourself. Because I know when I was in my 20s and 30s, a compelling personality I am, vulnerable, attractive. All of this is said not from big enough, from self-awareness. I could do a lot more damage.
Okay.
Because I could recruit people into my drama very easily. And I think if I'd have had that desire to fight, to stick around a bit longer and work through some of the tougher stuff. So all of these things are marvellous, but there's still you that wakes up with you or goes to bed with you that has to make sense of your circumstances.
Yeah.
And the people I admire most are the ones that are prepared to sit and ride it out and do that work, because in the end they cause a lot less mischief for people.
Yeah, yeah. Could you share the story about when you went to visit a medium and the message that came through from your dad?
Okay. Well, there's a number, but I went to see, a friend of mine bought me a tarot card reading, and it was going to be over Zoom, which I couldn't understand. I'd always had my gran there with the tea leaves.
Yeah.
Or I'd had the cards. So anyway, I didn't quite understand, but I went on to this call, and it was with a gentleman called Grant Harris. And
Grant has been on your podcast.
Yes, he has. He's my most successful podcast ever. People do like stories about ghosts.
Oh, well, that's exciting, because he's been on my podcast, but it hasn't been released yet.
Has he really?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
Oh no, giddy. Well, that'll help you viewing. But my figures, my God, Grant's following is incredible. But anyway, so I go on this Zoom call, and Grant says, I'm more of a medium than a tarot reader. I said, all right. He said, are you all right with that? I said, oh, absolutely, no problem. He said, I'm glad. He said, because I've got a gentleman here on the other side, and he's telling me he's your dad. And he described him. I said, yeah. Anyway, he said, your dad's not very... He said, your dad's not best pleased with you at the moment. I said, how's this? My dad's been dead 10 years and he's still giving me his school report. He said, apparently you're playing it too small. Apparently people around you are taking a lot more risks. They're out there getting their word out. And he said, and you're playing it too small. And he wants you to take more risks. He wants you to put yourself out there, take opportunities to get out and bigger in the world. And I was going, oh, right. He said, well, actually, he said, and I'm telling you this, you'll be global by the end of the year. And I went, right, first and foremost, Grant. And I remember saying, Grant, I've not had an affair with the rock star, so I haven't got a bloody love child tucked away. There's no skeletons in the closet that are going to, there's nothing that's going to make me global that suddenly when it's revealed. He said, well, believe you me, you're going to be global. And a month later, I recorded my first podcast. And I didn't attach the two things together. I did it on absolute whim. And the first one went really well. The next one with Zelda went to about 35 countries in a matter of weeks. Yeah. And I was hooked. And I love the fact that my dad turned up and said, look, you're doing well. You've married, but basically get up there and live a bigger life. And then I spoke to a guy recently and he gave me this quote. It came from the yoga teacher of Sarah Pascoe, the comedian. And she said, the quote is, nothing to prove and everything to share. And in my 60th year, it feels like I'm inviting people on podcasts to share profound things. I invited you to do the same. I'm sitting here picking over old wounds and old scars. But I do feel that if anybody can find their place of some hope or some insight in all of the things that we're doing, that gives them just that moment to stabilise them for that bit longer, to say there will be a time for this season in your life and it will pass. And for me, if somebody could have reassured me that I would love again. Yeah. Because at that point, at 23, 24 years of age, I'd written a script that I was unlovable and would never love again. I mean, that was the biggest joke ever. But it was so powerfully rejecting. Yeah. It felt like that was the way it was going to be for me. So there's a number of things within it. But sometimes, you've had something pretty extraordinary happen to you. Having a broken heart can be really binned off as quite every day. It's part of building your resilience. But actually, those deep cuts can really inform our lives for a long time. But if I saw this chap now, I'd smile. Because it was painful. I made it a lot more painful with the way I behaved and didn't stop, didn't take account, didn't do the healing at the right time. There was a lot of didn'ts.
But you did the best you could do with what you had.
I was reeling, and it was the 80s and the 90s, and I was doing very well at work and it was a very heady time. But I would feel he made his choice. I was to go on and repeat his behaviour in different ways with different people. If somebody did a podcast about how I hightailed out after 6 weeks of marriage, it'd make a good one. Yeah. But in that moment of devastation, we have choices about how we pick ourselves up and put ourselves back together again. And if I could have done a more elegant job of doing the work at that time, I wish I could have, but I was what I was at the time.
Yeah. And here you are, 60 years of age, looking absolutely gorgeous and glamorous, happily married, 2 successful, beautiful adult children, successful career, an amazing podcast that has gone absolutely global. I'm very jealous about that. What would you like to say to your dad now if you could give him a message?
Oh God, well, I know that I've made him proud.
Yeah.
But I know after my dad died, I did block off a lot of the grief because my relationship with my dad was such a pivotal one. But I would just say, I really miss you. I really miss my dad.
Yeah.
And I know that if I could have ever done a podcast in my life, I would have done it with my dad.
Oh.
I would love to have done a podcast with my dad. He was such a brilliantly bright man. But I know he's around me, and I know he's a lot happier with the way things have turned out.
It's all right, Dad. She's turned out good.
My school report's definitely gone up from a C-.
I think you're an A star now, Catherine.
For the time it lasts, because at the moment I'm riding strong. I'm happy and I feel very positive about where I'm in life. There'll be whatever's coming's coming. I do hope that any of you listening out there have found some hope. It might not be the intended hope I wanted to give you from the message, but I got to love again, and I was only equipped to be the partner that is able to sustain a relationship by doing some much needed growing up.
And I think that's a perfect place to end the podcast. Wise words, Catherine. Thank you so much for being a guest and for sharing your story and for being brave today. Thank you.
My absolute pleasure.
Grief doesn't always follow the rules. Sometimes it comes without a funeral, without closure, and without a clear ending. And yet, as we heard today, even in that silence, even in the absence, there is still space for healing, growth, and self-discovery. If today's conversation resonated with you, know that you are not alone. Your experience is valid, your pain is real, and your healing, however slow, is unfolding in its own time. If you found comfort in this episode, subscribe to this podcast today so you don't miss any future episodes. Please also subscribe to Catherine's podcast, Gobsmacked, which can be found on all podcast platforms. Until next time, be gentle with yourself and thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of A Gift for Grief. Please feel free to share it with your friends and family, and let's encourage others to become more grief literate. If you're struggling with your grief or worried about your mental health, please do speak to your doctor. For more information about my story and my 2 books about grief, visit my website www.louisebates.co.uk. The music on this podcast was written and recorded by Matthew Bates and can be found on his 2 albums, Fight Back and Kaleidoscope.